Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video. And the war within is right around the corner, and we're all going to have to make a very important decision, which is what class are we going to be maining into this expansion. And it can be nerve-wracking. It can cause a lot of anxiety to do because it feels like such a big commitment, and you don't want to be let down. So the purpose of today's video is to outline 5 major points you should be considering when picking your main class or specialization so that you can have the best experience possible for your needs and your desires. And as always, if you want to stay up to date with news related to World of Warcraft, smash that subscribe button. Now, the War Within is coming out with a whole bunch of new features, options, and content for a wide variety of players. They are introducing delves for competitive solo group play, which is amazing, and it's going to be awesome for players who want to do that. But it means another avenue of content that you need to consider for a main, not to mention that solo queue battlegrounds are coming in. So if you're somebody who's been really itching for some battlegrounds, but you're not too interested in the LFG process of finding a group, these battleground blitz rated solo queue battlegrounds have been popping off in the pre-patch, and I'm imagining they're going to continue to do so moving into the actual release of the expansion. And it is awesome, it is great, and it is fantastic, which leads us into our first point when picking a main, is that you want to consider the content that you want to do. Are you somebody that wants to focus in on something specifically? Do you want to be the solo delve player and trying to push your limits in that content? Do you want to be a Mythic Plus player? Are you going to be focusing in on dungeons? Are you going into raids? Do you want to be, trying to push your parses? Are you going into arenas or battlegrounds? You really want to consider what is going to be your main mode of play. Do you want to have options, flexibility to be able to switch between those? Because some specializations are excellent in one avenue and maybe terrible in another. And of course, I've got content on my channel here to outline specifically what specs are good in what content, as well as many other content creators. So it's really important that you check out, things like tier lists are a good scouting tool to see how, what spec are you considering as being the most competitive for what content. And the reason that this is important is because when you are looking for groups, you're going to struggle if you're picking a specialization that might be performing towards the lower end of the totem pole in terms of forming a group. And it's going to take a long time. It's going to be really difficult in those cases and those instances. So it's definitely something to consider. It's not the be all end all, because if you do have friends, you can sometimes get them to play with you, with whatever it is that you're doing, regardless of its competitive viability. But one of the most important things to consider on this list is consider the content that you want to do and prepare accordingly with that. You care more about flexibility or focusing in on something, which then leads into the second point on picking a main in the War Within, which is time available to play. So if you're somebody who's got a job, you got a family, you got kids, you got some other responsibilities going on, you've only got a few, maybe a couple of hours, maybe if you're lucky, at the end of the day, or are you somebody living in the basement, leeching off your parents, and you got 12 hours a day and you want something that's going to keep you entertained for as long as possible every day, moving into this is something that you really want to take into account. So there's two main points with this. One is the difficulty of the class. If you don't have a lot of time to play, you may want to err towards the side of simplicity and something that is easier to pick up. And as always, there's content all over YouTube to be able to make that decision, but you definitely want to consider simplicity versus complexity. If you're somebody who has a lot of time on your hands and you want mastery and you never want to be bored, you're probably going to want to pick something that's more difficult to play. And if you're somebody with less time and you've got more responsibilities, you may want to err on the side of something that's more simple, so you can log in and get your dopamine hit, feel good about yourself a little bit with a couple of hours that you have to play. Also, you want to consider roles when you have time available to play. So things like healers and tanks are always in high demand, and you will have shorter queue times, a faster process in looking for group. So if you really want to make sure that you're actually getting game time and not just sitting on a menu, then make sure you consider possibly either picking a spec that can multi-role, something like DPS and healer or DPS and tank. So when maybe on a night where you really want some games, you can switch to the healer specialization or switch to the tank specialization, depending on if you're doing dungeons or PvP, etc. And make sure that you're getting, the valuable content out of the time that you have available to play, which then leads us into fantasy and playstyle. this is probably underpinning the most important thing when it comes to picking a main class or specialization is, does it really satisfy you with the flavor that you're going for, right? Do you want to be a warrior just crushing people under your power? Do you want to be a warlock rotten, withering your opponents or destroying them with chaos? Or do you want to freeze your enemies and completely debilitate them and prevent them from advancing their attacks towards you? Or do you want to be sneaking around in stealth, ambushing and assaulting enemies? I think that fantasy, playstyle, and flavor and fun are probably the most important thing that you want to be considering when you're going into an expansion and when you're picking something, because if it doesn't fit the right flavor of fantasy that you're going for, you're not going to jive with it. You're probably going to spend less time playing it. You're probably going to get bored of it or stop. So, competitive viability is important. And if you're somebody with limited time, maybe you do consider it more than others. But if you have friends and your time isn't really a big factor, then you can kind of get away more so with selecting on the fantasy and playstyle front, even if the specialization or class that you're going for isn't necessarily competitive. I also think that they are trying to do a much better job of making sure that there are more specializations viable, so that if you do want to pick something for fantasy, fun, or playstyle, that it doesn't end up just being like you're at the bottom of the list in LFG. Nobody wants to invite you. Nobody wants to take you to things. And it becomes really difficult, right? Because that's going to be the number one thing that leads to player loss and a lack of player retention is competitive viability. So just keep up to date with the changes. I'm relaying them here as I see them to make sure that things are going in that direction, so that you can make sure that you can really pick around the fantasy and play style of a specialization without worrying too much with the competitive viability, because that leads into the next point here, which is that you need to consider what your goals are. Do you want to be trying to compete for Race to World first? Do you want to try to play in the MDI? Do you want to try and play at an Arena World Championship level? Do you want to play at that top 0.1%? Or are you kind of just happy jamming it out and having a good time with it and just playing more casually and less competitively? Because there are sacrifices that have to be made if you want to be going into the top 0.1%. And I've seen that from players that have been playing the game for years on Mythic Plus side as well as PvP, where certain specializations, maybe they got a certain talent pruned away that's now making them not as competitively viable in the content that they want to do. And they're aware that playing at the top 0.1% means that they're riding the bench for their raid roster, or finding a group in LFG is going to be borderline impossible. And they're taking the necessary sacrifices in order to continue to compete at the top 0.1% by re-rolling to something that is going to be suited for that. Now, obviously, you don't need to have that at the lower rankings. I think for the most part, almost every spec is competitively viable outside of the top 0.1% scenarios. But the community is very notorious for basically holding you up to those 0.1% standards, even at lower rankings, which can be really discouraging when you're trying to form your group and when you're trying to get content going through together, because you really don't need it. Someone playing 50th percentile specialization in terms of power at a 100% capacity is probably going to outperform someone playing a 1% percentile spec at 10% of the capacity. But people are blinded by just he's not that spec, he's not that class, and there aren't a lot of other metrics for them to be able to assess whether or not they should invite somebody to their group. And obviously they just want to make sure that the content is run as smoothly as possible and as successfully as possible, because in a lot of pug situations, if it isn't, everything falls apart. You lose your key, you lose your group, it downgrades, and then everything becomes frustrating. Or in PvP, you have to go through the whole process again. So ultimately, some of that elitism towards group building is just trying to make sure that there's security in the group's success. And I'm kind of hoping that they find better ways for players to be able to present, resumes basically in LFG in order to show like, hey, I might be playing a warrior, and maybe warrior isn't the best right now, but this is my record, these are my previous commitments, and my levels of success and my average DPS or something. A little bit more of a better way of outlining, like, I can make this group succeed. We don't need that top 0.1%, but also making sure that they're just balancing the classes better, so the discrepancy between them isn't, any sort of canyons or wide gaps. It's as little as possible, so that this isn't going to be an issue for it. But these are my main points my main strategies here, as I've outlined in this video, in order for you to pick a class or specialization to start competing in the next expansion. I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. I hope that it does help you. And as always, thank you very much for watching the video. I will see you in the next one.